All right, Nico, can you say, welcome to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies?
It's a happy episode. Happy babies. Dad, I don't sound like that anymore.
I know, but you were only 3 years old when you did that, and you were cute, and people love it. Do you want to try it again?
Sure. Healthy babies.
No, it's Healthy Births, Happy Babies.
Happy births, healthy babies.
Healthy Births, Happy Babies.
Happy births.
Oh, no. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies. I'm Dr. Jay Warren. I'm a prenatal and pediatric chiropractor here in San Diego, and I'm also the host of the podcast, obviously. On today's episode, we're going to be having a really important conversation, albeit a difficult one. We're going to be talking about miscarriage and pregnancy loss. And my guest is Dr. Kate White. She's an OB-GYN that practices on the East Coast outside of Boston, Massachusetts. She's also the author of the book we're going to be discussing, Your Guide to Miscarriage and Pregnancy Loss, Hope and Healing When You're No Longer Expecting. She's a mom, and she's also a miscarriage survivor herself. And so she's going to be able to share with us today not only her perspective as a woman and as a parent who's experienced loss, but also as a doctor that cares for patients that go through this experience. And one of the major things I got from her book is not only all the different things that can be done to support a woman and the couple going through a loss like this, but that also how common it is. And even though it's so common, it's still not really talked about. And that's just something that I really felt strongly adding to the library of this podcast, to be able to have not just information about, healthy pregnancies and happy babies and postpartum and parenthood, but then also the other side of it, which is very common and something that touches all of our lives. And she shares so much knowledge, yes, and information, but then also wisdom and heart for all of us to be able to navigate this difficult situation just a little bit better. So let me introduce her to you, and then we'll dive right into our conversation. Dr. Kate White is a board-certified OB-GYN and has been caring for patients for more than 20 years, teaching them about their sexual and reproductive health and helping them navigate periods, family planning, childbirth, pregnancy loss, and every other stage leading up to menopause. She currently runs the Beacon Family Planning Research Unit, where she leads cutting-edge research studies into developing new birth control methods and discovering how doctors can better provide healthcare for all women. She's the author of the book, Your Sexual Health, also the one that we'll be discussing today, Your Guide to Miscarriage and Pregnancy Loss. So with that, let me switch over to my conversation with Dr. White. All right, Dr. White, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you're here. I am excited because I always love talking with new people, but obviously the subject can be a difficult one for people, but I'm really happy that you're, one, have written this book we're going to talk about, but also here to talk about this because I've done a number of episodes with moms that have experienced loss and coming from their perspective and the like, but I'm really happy to have a part of this library of my podcast. Like your one expertise, you're obviously coming from a woman and mother's perspective, but then also as a doctor and dealing with many, many patients that you work with, dealing with miscarriage and pregnancy loss as well. So I just, in advance, thank you for all of this. And what I want to really kind of start with is in the beginning of your book, you emphasize this really, really well in that it's a difficult subject, but it happens to so many women, and women still feel alone in the process. And this is what you really wanted to change about it. So like, how did the book and your experience all come about and come into play with this?
Yeah, I joked that I thought I was a pretty good empathetic doctor, that I didn't really need the universe to send me a lesson about how to be
Mm,
more connected to my patients. But there is something about going through these experiences yourself. So I had been taking care of women, and people who can get pregnant for years,
yeah.
but experiencing my own losses, one at 29 weeks and then one at 5 weeks, puts you into a whole different group, a whole different kind of section of society where you actually feel very off to the side. It's very isolating going through a pregnancy loss because you really feel like you have failed in some way. You got
Mhm.
pregnant, especially when you're pregnant where the world can see. And then all of a sudden, you don't get to go home with a baby, which for a lot of women, even if they consider themselves very talented and capable people who can do a lot of things besides reproduce, you're also supposed to do that. And so
Mhm.
when you don't, you can feel incredibly alone. And as you said, given how common pregnancy loss is, it is a tragedy that the loss itself and all of that pain is compounded by that isolation.
Yeah. I mean, that was something that you also, I would love for you to talk more about, is that there's not just the physical loss and the physical experience of it, the emotional toll like has much more to do with all the loss of potential. Talk more about that.
Yeah. And this is why people sometimes think that, oh, well, a later in pregnancy loss must somehow be worse than an early loss. One of my
Mm,
second loss was at 5 weeks. No one knew I was pregnant except for my husband. But what people who haven't been down this road don't always get is that when the stick turns to the positive side or the two lines, you all of a sudden envision an entirely new life.
mhm.
You think about your family either starting or growing. If you have other kids, you think about how they're going to be good older brothers or sisters. You may be thinking about what the Christmas card is going to look like, how you're going to announce this on social media. And then you think about after the baby is born and you start having all these hopes and dreams. Is it going to be a girl or a boy? Are you going to give them a name that the family, is passing down, and then school and steps and graduation and weddings. And so when you have a loss, you lose all of that, all of those hopes and dreams, that entire envisioned future is gone in an instant. And even if the pregnancy is 5 days old, dreams don't take that long to have. And
Right.
so that whole world just collapses.
Right. And I think it was specifically working with dads and having been worked or talking with men that have been through that, that's a big disconnect, that they don't really understand like all that happened in a relatively short period of time. And it's not that they don't feel the loss, they just didn't go down the path as much, and that can be a really big disconnect between the partners.
Yeah, grieving after a loss can be really tough on a couple, whether or not you're married, whether or not you've been together for a long time or a little time, because there's a person who is physically undergoing the loss itself, which can be really
Mm.
painful and scary, and then the person who's just sort of on the outside of that. And this cuts both ways. The often male partner doesn't completely get what it's like to sort of have that life taken out of you, especially if you were the one who could feel the baby kick. And then my husband, of course, felt the baby kick from the outside, but it wasn't the same as having our daughter kicking me all day long for months. It was such a different loss in the memory of it on a daily basis. But on the other side of that is that men and partners get no attention when someone is
Mm.
having a loss. My husband was virtually ignored. And his experience, I think, is very typical of a lot of men who are expected to be strong and there for their partner. And it's hard for men to cry in our society as it is, but now you're supposed to be strong for her. But my husband was grieving just as much as I was, but he didn't have an outlet. No one asked him how he was doing. No one offered him therapy, or a
Right.
shoulder to cry on. So it's really tough on a couple.
Mm-hmm. And I would can only imagine like the woman takes on a lot more, can put more pressure on herself to like help him through it, as well as like what she's going through on her own. So it's even more compounded.
For like when you're a super loving couple, right? You don't want to see the person that you love in pain. And so it's like, okay, well, I don't want to necessarily talk about how I'm feeling because then
Right.
they're going to feel bad about it. So I need to find someone else to talk to, but I want to be honest, but I want to hide, and it's just, it all gets mixed up, and it's all coming out of love, but it does make the situation more complicated.
Right. Right. And do you find in your practice or even in your own personal experience, like the earlier on in the pregnancy, the easier it is?
It's really different. I mean, stillbirth late in a pregnancy is always hard on everybody.
Hmm.
Early loss really varies. There are people who are very able to take it in stride, recognizing that miscarriage is really common and being sad, but they'll be able to try again. But for people who have tried for a long time, who thought they weren't going to be able to get pregnant, IVF pregnancies that were super hard fought for and really expensive to get, it's very possible that even a very early loss is just as devastating as one that's later.
Right. And I think either for the circles around the couple or even within the couple to just be very cognizant of that, of, there isn't any time frame of like, we should be over this by now, or it's something that can affect anyone, and then it ripples out into the rest of the family too. I mean, do you have advice like for the couples that are, not only dealing with their own grief, but then for their family as well?
Yeah, managing the family's reaction is a whole, it's actually a whole other chapter in my book, and it was
Yeah.
a whole other personal experience that I now get to identify for patients and talk about it with them. That your own parents are going to have different reactions based on if they had experience with losses or if it's completely new, um, and it can really range from incredibly supportive to actually really smothering to completely not understanding and wondering why you're not over it. I so hate that phrase about
Yeah.
being over it, right? And
Right.
this is for any kind of loss. I'm a big fan of this concept of growing around your grief, that the
Mm.
grief kind of creates a hole. I mean, I always see it as actually like a hole in my heart because that's how it felt. And that the hole is there, but your life just grows bigger around it, that
Mm.
you learn how to incorporate that grief into your life. So it never really goes away. And there are certainly things that will trigger sadness even years later, but you recognize that life goes on. You can find joy in other things. And then the grief just becomes a part of you. It's not either or, it's and.
Right. In a previous episode, a mom who was sharing her story about losing her baby around a year talked about learning to carry her grief rather than get rid of the grief. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. And I don't think that is something that this culture at least does very well. It is a get over it. You should be by now and moving on. And like conversations like this and books like that you've written give a space for a process to occur and some more acceptance and carrying and growing around, rather than thinking like I should be through this, and if I feel any sadness and grief, like there's something wrong or I'm not doing it right.
Yeah, we don't deal well with hard things. We don't deal well with loss and death of any kind, right? I think we probably deal with like lost pets really well, but like not loss of
Mm,
anything else.
yeah.
We don't like to talk about it. We don't prepare for it. And doctors have no training in this. So when a
Mm,
doctor is met with a patient who is completely crumbling, they do not know what to say. And it is normal for them to either spout a lot of science or to run out of the room. And so one thing I have gotten much better at because of my own experiences is just leaning into it, is learning how to hold that space for a patient to share what they need to. And it's important to sort of find people in your lives who can do that for you. But again, it is hard for a lot of people.
right. And what about, I mean, the same concept must be true then for like friends and family members. I mean, all of us have been touched in some way this way and possibly will in the future. Like, what advice do you give for like your friends, your family, or friends, family members to be able to do that same thing, space rather than gloss over it, or do something that's going to be actually supportive for the couple that's experienced a loss?
I think it's being really upfront about what it is that you need. Because I think
Mm,
that, again,
mm,
even though there are a lot of similarities for people who have had pregnancy loss, everyone's journey is really different. Everyone grieves differently in different ways. Like, I wanted to talk about it incessantly. I am half
mm.
Italian. I'm from New Jersey. I talk all the time. And of course, I wanted to talk about this. My husband, who is from Texas, did not want to talk about it at all. And so it is putting out there, okay, tonight I need to talk about it
Mhm.
with a friend, with family. It's, I actually want to process. It's really common for friends and family to, after a certain period of time, never bring up the pregnancy
Mm.
because they're afraid of making you upset or bringing up bad memories. Like, you're not thinking about it all the time anyway.
Yeah.
And so you give them space and freedom to actually say, no, it's okay to ask me. It's okay to ask about the baby, especially if it was later in pregnancy or neonatal death, and you've named the baby, to ask how you're doing, how are thoughts going, how are you remembering? I'm here if you want to talk. And so then to express, here's when I want to talk about it, or conversely, I don't want to.
Right.
I am going to grieve in different ways. I don't want to. And when people want to do something, sometimes they will do what they would have wanted. So you may get 15 casseroles if you have people in a family, who want to cook, which may be perfect for you to stick them all in the freezer and then you don't have to cook for a while. If you really don't want food, it's okay to say, you know what I really need is someone to walk the dog every night, right?
Right. Yeah.
Walk the dog. What people at my office did for me when I was recovering from my first loss was they got me a housekeeper for 2 months, which to
What a
this day is
beautiful
one of the
gift.
best presents I've ever gotten, to not have to worry about cleaning my toilet during those 2 months of
Right.
recovery. And so if you can identify what you need, put that out there, because I promise you, your family and friends are desperate to have something to do to help you. They just
Yeah.
want to know what to do.
Right. Right. And I think, finding something that can channel that energy is so important for us as supporters. And at the same time, we can come across as overbearing. And as you said, like, all right, I do not need another casserole. Thank you. But being able to be vocal about like, well, this is what I need, I think is part of the healing process as well.
Yeah. And also, but no pressure early. When you're in the throes of initial grief, it can be hard to even think about anything. Like you may not even be able to shower each day, let alone be able to
Mhm.
eloquently express to your loved ones, what you need. But as you
Yeah.
come out of that initial fog of grief and really start to know what would be helpful and not,
Mhm.
express that to the people that you love.
Right. And is it in a physical sense, are there times that you're recommending as far as like women going through either you've mentioned in your book about treatment or things that you really want to kind of insulate yourself in a not a because we're talking about like in an emotional sense, but in a physical sense as well?
I think that self-care happens on all the levels, right? It happens on the
Yeah.
physical level of
Smart.
don't put yourself through too much stress. But that said, if you really like love to exercise and it keeps you sane, as long as your body is telling you it's okay, you should go out and do that.
Yeah.
Um, and self-care on the emotional side of saying no to commitments that you don't really need to do. If you don't want to go to the family Christmas party this year, or the work party, or someone's baby shower, when you get that first invitation for someone else's baby shower, you do not have to suck it up and go. You
Yeah.
can say, you know what? Too much right now. Send a lovely gift. It will be just fine.
Yes. Very healthy. Drawing boundaries and being really real with yourself around like what it takes. Because I think there is that pressure too, going back to like getting over it, of it might translate into like trying again, right? Is there any kind of rule, not rule, but recommendations you have around like how to couples can arrive at a time where they feel that it's right for it, or guidance, and how do we determine whether we're at that point?
Yeah, for your typical miscarriage of a pregnancy that was in the uterus, where it's the first trimester of pregnancy, which are what most losses are,
Mhm.
you can get pregnant the month after you miscarry.
Mm,
The body is ready to go. The biological imperative to reproduce is really strong. And I tell my patients that your body may be ready well before your heart is. And
mhm.
so it's why I actually bring up birth control to say, look, you may not be feeling like having sex, and that's totally fine, but you need to know that if you want some space before another pregnancy could happen, you may want to do something to prevent one. And so I think it is really important for couples to talk about how they're feeling, because for some couples, they want to get pregnant again as soon as they can. That's what's going to make them feel better, is
Mhm.
trying again and getting pregnant again. Other couples just want time to
Yeah.
mourn this loss before even thinking about starting again. So like everything else in relationships, open communication is really critical.
Right. And you were, I want to make sure I talk about this too, that you did such a great job in the book too of in explaining all the different types of pregnancy loss, whether it's first trimester, second, the like, all the reasons that it can happen. Like you really iterate really well of there's nothing wrong with you. necessarily that caused it to feel guilt that I did something wrong. I mean, there's so many factors in that, but the majority of them are way beyond our control or beyond the woman's control. So that feeling of we can't get pregnant again because there's something wrong with me, like really need, like your book does a great job of like explaining those kind of things so that you can make an informed choice around it rather than feeling like something's off.
100 years ago, 200 years ago, miscarriages were super common and they weren't so weighted the way they are now. Miscarriages happened all the time. People talked about it, it was sad and people moved on. Now, I think because we think we can control everything. We think that if we eat all the right things and try to stay healthy and go to the visits and take the vitamins, even though they're really big and hard to swallow, and you deal with the nausea, that you should have a good outcome.
Right.
And the problem is that all those things are important towards helping to have a good outcome, but you can't control the chromosomes of a pregnancy, which is like the biggest loss, or biggest reason why losses happen. And so people are actually really shocked sometimes when a miscarriage happens. Like, what do you mean it's a loss? I did all the right things. This wasn't supposed to happen, which then that sort of compounds it. And I think that talking people through, it is not your fault. You didn't do anything to cause this. Your body is not broken. You just rolled the dice and it landed on the wrong number this time. And that next time that pregnancy is likely to be perfectly healthy, which is not meaning you should rush into it, but you need to know that you are okay, even if it doesn't feel like you're okay or going to be okay.
And I'm sure that must be just even harder for couples that have been trying for a long time and not able to conceive and then do, but there's a loss. They can't help but go into that space, right? Of I did something wrong this time. It took us forever. We finally did, and I did something wrong this time.
You also start feeling like the universe is sending you a message. Like, oh, I'm not meant to be a mother. We're not meant to be a parent. So people start imbuing the loss with a lot of meaning, well beyond just the fact that there was a chromosomal abnormality and the pregnancy didn't grow.
Right.
And so I try to get people to recognize that thinking that the universe is not sending you a message for past behavior. I don't care if you had a wild youth or what happened in your past. This is not retribution. This is not in any way linked, to morals or ethics or behavior. This was a conception that was just not meant to be a healthy baby, and don't make it mean more than it is. But it can be really hard.
Yeah. Is it true that like some women have more miscarriages than others?
Yeah, it is more common to just have one miscarriage, depending on how many times you get pregnant. About 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 pregnancies will end in a loss. And if you have 3 or 4 pregnancies in your lifetime, likely one of them will be a loss. Happily, only a small proportion of women will suffer from recurrent losses, about 3 to 5%. But there are people who are battling some other reason why, beyond just the genetic bad luck of a particular pregnancy, that there's a uterine or cervix problem, an immune problem in their blood, underlying medical illness. There are some other reasons why people may have to work a little harder, hope a little more that the next pregnancy is going to be okay.
Okay. So as common as it is for a loss to happen, if it's happening more often then that might be an indicator of pursuing more kind of women's health issues, as you said, about like implantation issues or things like that. That is more unusual, is what I'm hearing.
2 miscarriages in a row, especially if you have never had a live baby, is reason enough to go to a gynecologist to start an evaluation. They used to say you had to wait for 3 losses, which is just really, really hard. Now the teaching is even 2 losses in a row, especially without a baby, time to get some workup. Could just be luck. It could be bad luck twice, right? Lightning can strike the same place twice. But at that point, probably worth getting a little bit of evaluation just to get a sense of what's happening.
Okay. And then as far as maternal age is concerned too, what are the stats and the numbers show on that?
Yeah, very sadly, Mother Nature has not caught up to women's evolution in society, right? We are all meant to be pregnant at 21. For everyone who demonizes teen pregnancy, there's a lot to be said about having babies when you are young, when you are super healthy and have lots of energy to handle it. Sadly, though, as people meet partners later, they have careers first, they want to finish graduate school, they want to be well established, and then they start trying to conceive. It is not only harder to get pregnant the older you get, but the miscarriage rate goes up as well.
Okay.
Fortunately, the numbers are still on your side until you're into your mid 40s, meaning even a 40-year-old woman is more likely to have a healthy baby than not, but miscarriage does become more common the older you get.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great to hear, because I see a lot of women in their like near 40, over 40. By virtue of the demographic, the area that I'm in, there's more women that are doing later. I remember I interviewed a prenatal chiropractor that was in Manhattan and said that almost all of her practice was over 40, because that demographic was like, right, we're doing different times. And at 40, like, all right, then now it's time to do the baby part. And they were having healthy pregnancies, and that whole advanced maternal age and geriatric pregnancy term came up.
Oh, don't even get me started.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it is true that the older you get, the harder it becomes, the higher the miscarriage risk. But parenthood is a big step, and it changes your life forever. I always joke that there are only two irreversible decisions: joining the military and deciding to become a parent. Everything else you can undo in your life. And you really want to be ready. So, and you have to balance that with the fact that your eggs aren't getting any younger, and you're not sure if you're going to have fertility problems later. And balancing those two things is really tricky.
Really important. Yeah. Well, with our last few minutes, we'll share like where people can get the book and learn more and everything. But what's the major take home that you'd like our listeners to get from either what we talked about in our conversation just now, or something we didn't touch on that you'd like for really to understand and to hear?
I would say that you'll hear a lot from your doctor and things you read about how common miscarriage is. I've said it at least twice tonight, but it's not common for you. And so what I want to do is actually validate the fact that this could be a really huge, devastating loss. We talked about the not feeling to the need to get over it, but I just want to recognize in the moment how big a deal this can be. Doesn't matter how early you were. If you were trying and you got pregnant the first try, and everyone's going to tell you all the things about how you can try again, you'll get pregnant later. This was when you wanted to be pregnant, and it is horrible for you that it did not work out. So give yourself that space for that grief. And the other thing I would say is that, to reiterate, that recovery is both physical and emotional. And that's why my book sort of has two pieces. The first is all about the medical components of loss, and about what it's like to go through it and what your options are, what you can control, what you can't. And then the road to recovery, which for some people is short, for some people is long. And you want to sort of tend to both of those parts on your journey.
Beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. So your book is Your Guide to Miscarriage and Pregnancy Loss, Hope and Healing When You're No Longer Expecting. Where's all the usual places that they can get it, or where would you like them to find out more information about you yourself too?
Right. So the book is available wherever people actually buy hardcover books or softcover books these days. So obviously all of your online retailers like Amazon and Barnes & Noble, in person or online, Target and Walmart often, but also independent booksellers also have this. So depending on sort of who you want to patronize. I have a website, drkatewhite.com. It's drkatewhite.com, where you'll see information about the book. I also have a blog where I'll talk about these issues as well. And people can write in questions to me that I'll then answer, because sometimes it can be really hard to find a doctor who speaks English and not just medicine. And so I want my website to be a service for that too.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll make sure all of those links, one to the book, but to your website, are in the show notes. So you listening can just click on over into that and connect. Well, again, Dr. White, thank you so much for being here and really helping our listeners navigate like a really difficult subject, but giving such great wisdom and great advice for it.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful talking with you.
And don't forget, I have 2 free offers for both moms and dads. First, for the moms, I have my 40 ways of connecting with your baby during pregnancy that you can get on my website at drjwarren.com/40ways. That's 40 ways. And for the dads, I have the 9 myths about becoming a dad that is also available on my site at drjwarren.com/9 myths. That's the number 9 myths. So both moms and dads are covered. Go check them out. I hope you enjoy them.